If you've ever felt like an absolute outsider or like you're constantly swimming upstream against the prevailing culture, today's deep dive is just custom built for you.
Oh, absolutely.
I mean, imagine waking up one morning and realizing that the very things you believe, the core convictions that give your life meaning and purpose and joy, have suddenly made you a complete social pariah.
Yeah, that is a jarring thought.
Right. You haven't moved a single inch, you haven't changed your address, but the ground beneath your feet has just fundamentally shifted. Suddenly you look around and you are a complete alien in your own hometown.
Mm-hmm.
People you used to do business with are like crossing the street to avoid you. The invitations to the neighborhood gatherings just stop coming. It's a very specific kind of psychological exhaustion.
It really is. It is a profoundly disorienting experience, that sudden gaping loss of belonging. And the thing is, it's not a uniquely modern phenomenon, even though the algorithms and the social media pylons make it feel brand new to us today.
Right. We think we invented getting canceled.
Exactly. We didn't. It is an incredibly ancient tension. When you step outside the accepted norms of any highly structured society, well, that society pushes back.
Yeah.
Hard.
Exactly. And that friction, that tension of being pushed to the margins is really the heartbeat of what we are unpacking today. We are going to look at one of the most brilliant survival manuals ever written for people in exactly that situation.
A literal lifeline.
Yeah. We are talking about the biblical book of 1 Peter. It's a first-century text written to early Christians facing intense social ostracism. And our mission today is to extract the profound historical gold, the literary brilliance, and the deep theological frameworks it offers. We're going to explore the Greek foundations, the gritty reality of the ancient Roman world, and the fascinating ways this single letter essentially rewired the psychology of early Christians.
Which makes it a fascinating text to put under the microscope for us today.
Yeah.
We really have to remember that we are exploring a document that operates from a deeply conservative, early Jewish Christian theological framework.
Right.
And to truly understand its power, we have to step inside that framework impartially. We have to view the world through the author's eyes to see how these ancient words function, not just as high-minded theology, but as a practical survival guide for people who thought they were losing their minds and their livelihoods.
So if we want to understand the power of this manual, we first have to understand the specific dangers the survivors were facing. We can't just read these words as if they, floated down to us on a cloud.
No, not at all.
We need to travel back to the 1st century and reconstruct the world breathing down the necks of the original readers, what scholars call the Sitz im Leben.
The Sitz im Leben. Yeah, it's a wonderful German scholarly phrase that literally translates to setting in life.
Setting in life.
Right. It's the original historical and social context. I mean, if you don't know the Sitz im Leben, you will fundamentally misread the text.
Yeah.
You'll think it's just a collection of detached, floating spiritual platitudes rather than a tactical response to a very real, very dangerous crisis.
So let's start with who is actually holding the pen here, or, well, who is dictating the words. The author introduces himself right out of the gate, and the opening is bold and honestly a bit jarring if you know the backstory.
It really is.
The Greek says, Petros apostolos Iousi Christou, Peter, an apostle of Jesus Christ.
Yeah.
This is Peter, the Galilean fisherman, the guy who famously and impulsively cut off a soldier's ear, the guy who walked on water and then immediately sank,
Yep, that Peter.
and the guy who denied even knowing Jesus on the night of the crucifixion before being restored. He's writing this near the end of his life, roughly around AD 60 to 65.
And that name, Petros, it carries immense institutional weight by the year AD 60. It's the Greek equivalent of the Aramaic Cephas, meaning the rock.
The rock, right.
Jesus himself gave him that nickname. So this isn't some anonymous philosopher writing a think piece. This is the man Jesus explicitly said he would build his church upon.
Wow.
So when a scroll arrives in your town, and the first word is Petros, it arrives with undeniable, earth-shattering apostolic authority.
But wait, here's what I find completely wild about this. If I'm picturing Peter, I'm picturing a rough-around-the-edges, blue-collar guy.
Oh, sure.
A fisherman from the backwaters of Galilee. His first language would have been Aramaic. But the Greek in 1 Peter is famous for being incredibly elegant. It's highly polished, upper-crust, sophisticated rhetoric. So how does a fisherman write like an Ivy League professor?
That is a brilliant question, and it's a detail that often trips up modern readers because, well, we have a very modern individualized view of authorship.
Sitting at a typewriter.
Exactly. You
Yeah.
sit alone at your laptop and type every single word yourself. But that is not how ancient literature worked at all. In the ancient world, particularly among leaders and officials, you utilized a trained scribe and amanuensis.
Amanuensis.
Right. And Peter actually tells us exactly who this is at the end of the letter. He mentions Silas, or Silvanus, describing him as a faithful brother.
So Peter is essentially pacing the room, delivering the theological core, the pastoral heart, the apostolic directives, and Silas is the one weaving it into this gorgeous literary Greek.
Exactly. Silvanus was likely a Hellenistic Jew, a Roman citizen, and a highly educated companion of both Paul and Peter. The amanuenses had, varying degrees of freedom in antiquity, but in a case like this, Silas is shaping the rhetoric.
Wow. Okay.
He is taking Peter's rugged foundational theology and crafting the syntax, the vocabulary, and the flow to perfectly resonate with a Greek-speaking audience. And, it doesn't dilute Peter's authority. It actually proves how seriously Peter took this mission. He wanted his message carried in the best possible literary vehicle.
Okay, so Peter is the architect, Silas is the builder. But where are they building this from? The letter says, right at the end, that it's being sent from Babylon.
Yes. That.
Now, if I pull up a map of the ancient world in 8060, and I look for literal Babylon in Mesopotamia that's hundreds of miles east of Jerusalem, it's basically a dusty ruin by this point, completely out of the political action. Why on earth is Peter writing from a ghost town?
Well, he's not. He wasn't sitting in Mesopotamia. In the Jewish and early Christian context of the first century, particularly as the tensions with the empire are really ramping up, Babylon is a highly charged apocalyptic code word.
Wait, really? So it's a code word?
Yeah. It means Rome.
Oh, wow. So it's like using a cipher to dodge the imperial mail readers.
That's certainly part of it, sure. It affords a tiny bit of political cover. If a Roman centurion intercepts the scroll, he just thinks it's a letter from the eastern provinces.
Mm-hmm.
But much more importantly, it is a profound theological statement.
Mm-hmm.
Think about the history. What was the original Babylon? It was the hyper-pagan empire that destroyed the first Jewish temple in 586 BC, burned Jerusalem to the ground, and dragged the Israelites away into exile.
Oh, I see. It's the ultimate archetype of the empire that sets itself up against God.
Precisely. By stamping Babylon on the origin line of this letter, Peter is telling his readers exactly how to view the world. He is saying, we are all living in Babylon now.
Man, that is heavy.
It is. Rome, with its marble pillars, its emperors demanding to be worshipped, its vast military machine. It is just the newest iteration of the empire of human pride. It is a spiritual wasteland. And this aligns perfectly with the historical tradition that Peter spent his final years ministering in Rome, eventually being martyred there under Emperor Nero.
That sets such a heavy, dramatic stage. He's writing from the belly of the beast, and who is he sending it to? The opening line says he's writing to people scattered across Pontus, Galatia, Cappadocia, Asia, and Bithynia.
Right.
If you look at a map, that is a massive swath of territory covering almost all of modern-day Turkey. And he calls these people elect exiles. I want to dig into the Greek word there because it's really fascinating.
The word is puripodoi. It translates roughly to resident aliens or temporary residents.
What did that actually mean on the ground in the Roman Empire? Were they literally immigrants?
In some cases, maybe. Yeah. But the term here is primarily sociological and spiritual. In the Greco-Roman world, society was incredibly stratified. You had full citizens who had voting rights, tax exemptions, and major social prestige.
The elites, basically.
Yeah. And then below them, you had resident aliens. These were people who lived in a city, paid taxes there, raised their kids there, and contributed to the economy. But they lacked the full rights, protections, and social standing of the native citizens.
So they were kind of stuck in the middle.
Exactly. They were perpetually viewed as outsiders. They belonged, but they didn't really belong.
So they are culturally marginalized. But Peter pairs that word with elect, chosen. Elect resident aliens. That sounds like a complete oxymoron.
It really does.
If you are chosen by the creator of the universe, shouldn't you be the VIP at the center of the culture, not kicked to the curb as an alien?
And that tension right there is the entire premise of the letter. Right away, in the very first breath, Peter is handing them a dual identity. The empire looks at them and says, you are strange. You are outsiders. You are puripodoi. But Peter looks at them and says, yes, you are outsiders to Rome, but only because you are insiders to God. You are fiercely loved, deeply desired, and handpicked by the King of Kings.
Wow. We really need to flesh out why they were treated as outsiders, though. Because when a modern person hears the phrase early Christian persecution, our minds instantly go to Hollywood movies.
Of course.
We picture the Colosseum, gladiators, Christians being thrown to the lions, massive state-sponsored executions, but the historical reality of the early 60s AD is quite different, isn't it?
It is a crucial distinction to make. The empire-wide, systemic, bloody persecutions, the ones where emperors were actively hunting Christians down, those mostly come later, in the 2nd and 3rd centuries.
Okay.
In the early 60s, what Peter's audience is facing is something much more insidious, chronic, and deeply personal. It's intense, pervasive social ostracism. The Greek word Peter uses repeatedly is katalia, which means slander, backbiting, or literally speaking against.
So they aren't dealing with lions, they are dealing with whispers. They are dealing with rumors, character assassination, and verbal abuse.
Exactly. And most damaging of all, they are dealing with exclusion from the economic and social networks of their cities. You have to understand that in the Greco-Roman world, there was absolutely no concept of the separation of church and state.
Right. That's a very modern idea.
Very modern. In the ancient world, there wasn't even a separation of religion and a Tuesday afternoon lunch. Religion and social belonging were completely, 100% inseparable.
If you belonged to the town, you worshiped the town's gods. It was just civic duty.
Yes. Think about trade guilds, which were the backbone of the ancient economy. Let's say you were a leather worker or a baker. To do business, to get wholesale prices, to sell your goods in the marketplace, you had to belong to the local guild.
Makes sense.
And every single guild had a patron deity. A guild banquet wasn't just a networking event, it was a religious ritual. It started with pouring out a libation of wine to the gods or to the emperor. They sacrificed an animal to Demeter or Apollo, and then the guild members sat together and ate the sacrificial meat.
Okay, this is where a modern analogy becomes incredibly helpful, I think. Imagine living in a classic company town 100 years ago, where the local coal mine or factory owns the houses, the grocery store, the local bank, everything.
Yes, perfect analogy.
Or, to bring it to today, imagine the most hyper-connected corporate culture or digital social network. If you suddenly stand up and say, I refuse to play by the unspoken cultural rules of the system anymore, you don't necessarily get thrown in federal prison.
No.
But what happens? You lose your livelihood, your reputation gets destroyed online, you get uninvited from the gatherings where all the real business deals happen. You are effectively canceled. It's a kind of social death.
That is a phenomenal analogy, because that is exactly what happened to these early Christians. Most of these believers were Gentiles. They grew up in this pagan system. They used to go to the guild banquets. They used to pour the wine to the emperor. But when they converted to Christianity, they realized they couldn't participate in idolatry anymore, so they just stopped going.
And to the Romans, this wasn't just a quirky, private religious disagreement. This was a direct threat to the fabric of society.
Completely. The Roman mindset was highly superstitious and deeply transactional. The logic was simple. The favor of the gods is what keeps the empire stable. The gods make the crops grow, they keep the barbarians away from the borders, and they stop the earthquakes.
So it's life or death for the whole city.
Exactly. If a group of people suddenly refuses to honor the gods, they are actively insulting the gods, which puts the entire city at risk of divine wrath.
So they weren't seen as just different, they were seen as dangerous.
Yes. The Roman historian Tacitus, writing a few decades later, called Christianity a mischievous superstition. He even recorded that Christians were convicted of hatred for the human race.
Hatred for the human race. That is just a wild, staggering accusation to hurl at a group of people whose entire moral framework is supposed to be built on loving your neighbor and turning the other cheek.
But it makes perfect sense to the Roman mind. If you won't sacrifice to the gods who protect the human race, well, you must hate humanity. We even have letters from Pliny the Younger, who was a Roman governor in Bithynia, which, crucially, is one of the exact provinces Peter lists in his opening greeting.
Oh, wow. The exact same area.
Yes, Pliny wrote to the emperor complaining about these Christians. He was deeply annoyed because the pagan temples were emptying out and the meat from the sacrificed animals wasn't selling in the local markets anymore because the Christians refused to buy it.
Wow. So they were hitting the local economy, they were disrupting the supply chain of the pagan temples. I mean, no wonder people hated them.
Exactly. They were viewed as unpatriotic, terrible for local business, and a fundamental danger to the social order. So their neighbors whispered about them. Their former friends accused them of incest and cannibalism.
Why incest and cannibalism?
Yeah, because they heard rumors about Christians having love feasts which is just their term for communion meals and eating the body and blood of their God.
Oh, man. Yeah, when you strip away the context, taking communion sounds absolutely terrifying to an outsider.
It really does.
So, bringing this back to our listener, if you are facing a one-time acute crisis, say a natural disaster or a sudden job loss, the adrenaline kicks in, you rally, you survive it, and then it's over. You rebuild.
Right, it's temporary.
But this catalia, this social ostracism, this is chronic. This is every single day. You go to the market and the baker won't sell to you. You walk down the street and your neighbors spit at your feet. How does someone survive the sheer grinding daily exhaustion of being a pariah? Because honestly, human nature dictates that eventually you just give in. You assimilate. You go back to the guild banquet just to make the pain stop and feed your kids.
And that temptation right there, the temptation to quietly blend back in, to compromise just enough to survive, that is the exact pastoral crisis Peter is addressing here.
Right.
He knows that these people are hanging by a thread. He knows that simply sending them a harsh checklist of moral rules like do this, don't do that, stop complaining, is absolutely not going to sustain them under that kind of crushing social weight.
Right. You can't just hand an exhausted, traumatized person a rigid rule book. They'll collapse under it. Which brings us to the fascinating literary structure of this letter. Because Peter realizes he has to give them more than rules. He has to craft a psychological masterpiece designed to completely rewire their identity from the inside out. Let's talk about the literary architecture of hope.
It's a brilliant piece of engineering. From a formal perspective, 1 Peter is classified as a diaspora letter. It was meant to be a circular epistle.
What does that mean exactly?
It means it wasn't written to a single congregation that just filed it away in a drawer. It was designed to be read aloud, from beginning to end, in house church after house church, passed from town to town along the Roman trade routes. And it is filled with what scholars call paranetic elements.
Paranetic. Let's define that.
It means exhortatory. It's a letter of intense persuasion, encouragement, and moral urging. It's meant to move the listener to action, and it does this through a very careful three-part macro structure that moves from the internal reality of the believer outward into their collision with the world.
Let's break down that three-part structure because it's wonderfully logical.
The first movement, which covers chapter 1 through the beginning of chapter 2, focuses entirely on salvation, belief, and holiness. It's all about their internal standing before God. It reminds them of their spiritual roots, their new birth, and the massive inheritance waiting for them.
Then once that foundation is laid, he pivots outward. The second section, chapters 2 and 3, focuses on submission, behavior, and harmony. This is the nitty-gritty external stuff.
Yeah, the practical application.
Like, how do you actually conduct yourself when your boss is a pagan who hates you? How do you behave in a culturally mixed marriage?
And then the final section, chapters 3 through 5, brings it all to a climax by addressing suffering, buffeting, and humility. This is where Peter really digs into the theology of pain, explaining how to stand firm in the midst of fiery trials by relying on the strength of Christ and the solidarity of the church community.
But what I find so compelling isn't just the logical outline of topics, it's the emotional intelligence behind it, the emotional arc. Peter is playing the rhetorical long game here. If you look at the opening lines, he doesn't start by saying, life is miserable right now, I know, but here are 10 things you need to do to survive.
No, not at all.
He starts by lifting their eyes up to the cosmos. He starts with astonishing doxological praise.
Yes, the emotional logic is absolutely perfect. He starts by anchoring them in what he calls a living hope through the resurrection of Jesus. He gives them a massive cosmic perspective. But, and this is vital for his credibility as a leader, he does not gaslight them about their pain.
That's so important.
He doesn't say, just smile, God is good. He looks their trauma right in the eye and validates it. There is a specific Greek phrase he uses early on, Olganardi, ideonodesin, libethentis.
Okay, unpack that for us. What does it sound like in English?
It translates roughly to, for a little while now, if necessary, you have been grieved by various trials. That word grieved is really heavy. It implies mental distress, sorrow, heaviness. Peter is looking at these scattered, ostracized Christians and saying, I know you are mourning. I know you have lost your status, your friends, maybe your wealth. I know this hurts deeply.
So he fully validates their sorrow.
He validates it, but in the exact same breath, he reframes it. He tells them this isn't random, meaningless suffering caused by a chaotic universe. This is a refining fire.
Like metallurgy. Like gold being purified.
Exactly the metaphor he uses. He tells them that their faith is infinitely more precious than literal gold. which, by the way, perishes even though it is tested by fire. The social friction they are experiencing is simply the heat burning off the impurities, proving the genuineness of their trust in God.
Wow.
This totally flips the script. It takes their meaningless, humiliating social suffering and suddenly infuses it with profound, eternal, cosmic purpose. They aren't victims, they are gold being prepared for the king.
And from that emotional peak of praise and validated grief, he uses some incredibly clever rhetorical tools to keep their new identity front and center.
I want to talk about inclusio, because when I look at the text, I notice a very specific framing technique.
Right. Inclusio is a literary bracketing device. It's an ancient way of defining the boundaries of a text.
The way I picture it is like the bun of a hamburger. The top bun, the very first verse of the letter, addresses them as exiles. Then you have 105 verses of incredibly dense, meaty theology and practical instruction in the middle.
The meat of the letter, literally.
Exactly. And then you get to the bottom bun, the very end of the letter, chapter 5, verse 13, and he signs off by saying, "She who is in Babylon, chosen together with you, sends you her greetings." He wraps the entire experience in this identity of being chosen exiles in Babylon. No matter what topic you're chewing on in the middle, you always taste that identity on the outside. That is a very tasty analogy, and highly accurate to how ancient rhetoric functioned. The inclusio ensures the listener never loses the plot. And inside that bun, Peter uses another powerful tool, chiasm.
I've heard this term thrown around in literary circles. What is a chiasm, and how does Peter actually use it to change their psychology?
A chiasm is an ancient poetic and rhetorical structure where ideas are presented and then repeated in reverse order. It forms a sort of ABBA pattern, making an X shape. The purpose isn't just to sound pretty. The structure physically forces the listener's ear and their brain to focus intensely on the center point, the pivot of the X.
Can you show us how that lands on the ear? What's an example in the letter?
Let's look at chapter 1, verses 24 and 25, where Peter is drawing a massive contrast between the Roman world and the spiritual world. Listen to the structure. A, all flesh is like grass. B, in all its glory like the flower of grass. B, the grass withers and the flower falls. A, but the word of the Lord endures forever.
Oh, I hear it.
Do you hear the pivot? The outer layers deal with the fragility of humanity and empire. The inner layers focus on the fading, dying nature of that glory, and it all crashes into the final, enduring truth, the word of the Lord. It's designed to make the massive, marble-clad Roman Empire look flimsy, temporary, and pathetic, while their unseen spiritual reality is portrayed as solid, permanent, and victorious.
Okay, this sounds beautiful and empowering, but hold on, I need to play devil's advocate here and push back on Peter's strategy. As we move into the middle sections of the letter, the text mentions what scholars call imperatival clusters.
Ah, yes, the commands.
These are rapid-fire, intense commands. Boom, boom, boom. Gird up the loins of your mind. Be sober-minded. Be holy in all your conduct. Love one another earnestly. Let's go back to our analogy. If I am Marcus the baker, and I am already traumatized, I've lost half my income, my kids are being mocked in the street, I am fundamentally exhausted, and an apostle sends me a letter just yelling a barrage of demands at me. That doesn't feel empowering. That feels crushing. Doesn't hitting an exhausted person with a heavy checklist risk completely burning them out?
If you strip the commands out of their context, yes, absolutely. If Peter had opened the letter with chapter 1, verse 13, "Therefore gird up your minds and be sober," it would have been devastating legalism. It would have broken them. But this is exactly why the structure we just discussed is the key to everything. He doesn't start with the commands.
Right. He spends the first 12 verses bathing them in grace.
Exactly. In theological terms, the indicative always precedes the imperative. What is true about you comes before what you must do. God's action precedes human reaction.
That's a great way to phrase it.
Peter spends the entire opening section telling them they are chosen, they are given a new birth, they are protected by God's power, and they possess an imperishable inheritance. When he finally gets to the rapid-fire commands, he hinges it on a very specific Greek transition word, tedio, therefore.
Because of all this incredible grace, therefore, act like it.
Precisely. Because you are infinitely secure, therefore gird up your minds. These commands aren't heavy burdens being strapped to their backs. They are weapons. They are tools being handed to them so they can take back their own agency in a chaotic world.
Tools for agency. I love that framing.
The empire was screaming at them. You are worthless losers. You are outcasts. We control your fate. Peter is telling them, no, you are chosen. You are purified. You are royal. Therefore, you have the power to control your own lives. You have the power to live distinctly holy lives. The emperor does not dictate your behavior. Your living hope dictates your behavior. It is an incredibly empowering shift in psychology.
Which perfectly sets the stage for the third major theme of our deep dive, intertextuality. Because if Peter is telling them to take back their agency, where do they get the historical weight, the psychological armor to actually do that?
Yeah.
He doesn't just invent a new self-help philosophy. He pulls off what I can only describe as the ultimate historical heist. He reaches deep into the ancient past, takes the most sacred texts of the Old Testament, and radically recontextualizes them for this audience of Gentile outcasts.
This is genuinely one of the most intellectually thrilling aspects of reading 1 Peter. The author is deeply soaked in the Hebrew Scriptures. He receives the Old Testament on its own terms, but he reads it through a completely new, explosive lens, the lens of Jesus Christ.
The lens of Christ.
The theological term for this is redemptive historical continuity. He is making the audacious claim that what God started centuries ago with the physical nation of Israel, he is now bringing to a massive global climax in the multi-ethnic church.
Let's look at some of the specific examples of how he borrows these texts, starting with the command to be holy. Peter quotes Leviticus 11 and 19, "Be holy because I am holy." Now let's look at the original setting of Leviticus. That book was written to the ancient Israelites who had just been freed from slavery in Egypt. They were wandering in the desert, preparing to enter a specific, physical, promised land.
Right? And in that original Old Covenant context, holiness was intensely tied to ritual and physical purity. It was about diet, very strict rules on what animals you could and couldn't eat. It was about territory. It was about separating themselves physically and ritually from the Canaanites and the surrounding pagan nations to maintain a pure physical camp where God's presence could dwell.
But think about who Peter is writing to. He is writing to Gentiles in Asia Minor. These are people who grew up eating pork and shellfish, who have zero connection to the physical land of Judea, and who are permanently scattered as exiles among their pagan neighbors. How on earth does a Levitical purity law apply to them?
It applies because Peter fundamentally re-engineers it. He disconnects the concept of holiness from the Old Covenant markers of ritual diet and geography, and he reattaches it to ethical and missional distinctiveness. Holiness for Peter's audience isn't about avoiding the local butcher shop. It's about avoiding malice, deceit, hypocrisy, envy, and slander.
It's an internal purity that manifests externally.
Exactly. He's taking the ancient call to be separate, but applying it to people who are physically embedded in pagan society. It's a call to live distinctly among the pagans, not to physically isolate in a desert commune away from them.
He does something similar with the prophet Isaiah. The text highlights his use of Isaiah chapter 40. All people are like grass, and all their glory is like the flowers of the field. The grass withers and the flowers fall, but the word of the Lord endures forever. Now, originally, Isaiah wrote that to comfort Jewish exiles who were living in the literal historical empire of Babylon. He was telling them, I know Babylon looks invincible with its hanging gardens and massive walls, but it will fade away. God's promise to bring you home is the only permanent reality.
And look at what Peter does with it. He maps that exact ancient prophecy directly onto his readers who are living under the shadow of the Roman Empire, which, as we said, he has already coded as the new symbolic Babylon.
Right.
He is telling them, look at Rome. Look at the marble temples. Look at the legions marching through your streets. I know Caesar looks like an eternal god who holds your economic fate in his hands, but listen to me. Rome is just grass. It is vegetation. The summer sun will hit it and it will wither into dust. The only thing in the universe that creates imperishable life is the gospel word that was preached to you.
It completely shrinks the empire down to size. It's highly subversive. But where this strategy really reaches its absolute peak is with what scholars call the stone texts. Peter pulls together a masterful interlocking mashup of three ancient passages, Isaiah 28, Psalm 118, and Isaiah 8.
It is a brilliant, intricate synthesis. If you go back to the Old Testament, these texts spoke of a cornerstone laid by God in Zion, a precious stone that the earthly builders foolishly rejected, but that God ultimately vindicated and made the foundation of his work. It also spoke of a stone that would cause rebellious people to trip and stumble.
Okay.
Peter takes these ancient architectural metaphors and typologically identifies this stone as Jesus Christ. Jesus is the ultimate rejected stone who was executed by the builders of society, Rome, and the religious elite, but whom God vindicated in the resurrection, making him the cornerstone of a whole new cosmic reality.
That is powerful on its own. But then Peter does something that must have made his original audience's jaws just hit the floor. He pivots from Jesus being the cornerstone, and he looks at these marginalized, exhausted Gentile believers, and he says that they are lithois entes, living stones.
Living stones being built up into a spiritual house, a new temple. Think about the physical and psychological reality of the people hearing this. These are people who are literally barred from entering the pagan temples of their own cities because they won't sacrifice.
Right.
Furthermore, the Jewish temple in Jerusalem is hundreds of miles away, and historically, as Gentiles, they wouldn't have been allowed into the inner courts anyway. And on top of that, within a few short years of this letter being written, that physical temple in Jerusalem is going to be utterly annihilated by the Roman army.
So they have nowhere to go. They are ritually homeless.
But Peter says, you don't need those buildings. The stones of those buildings will be thrown down. You are the temple now. The Spirit of the living God doesn't dwell in a building in Jerusalem anymore. He dwells in you, collectively, as you are built upon Christ.
Which leads perfectly into what I think is the emotional climax of the whole letter, the ultimate identity swap. Peter draws heavily on Exodus 19 and the prophet Hosea. He looks at these Gentile converts and calls them a chosen people, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession. Let's pause and let the sheer weight of those titles sink in. Where do those titles come from?
They come from the very foundational bedrock of the Jewish faith. In Exodus chapter 19, the Israelites are standing at the foot of Mount Sinai. There is thunder, smoke, and lightning. God is making his defining covenant with them, and he bestows these exact titles exclusively upon the nation of Israel. They were the unique, jealously guarded markers of Israel's special status before Yahweh.
I just have to highlight the absolute mind-bending irony of this moment. Think about who Peter is talking to. You have these Gentile converts, Greeks, Romans, Phrygians, people who, for centuries, were historically considered nobodies, outsiders, dogs, or strictly unclean by Jewish standards. They had zero ethnic or historical claim to the God of Abraham. And Peter, a circumcised, Torah-observant Jewish apostle who grew up fiercely guarding that ethnic boundary, looks at these culturally exhausted, bleeding Gentile outcasts. And he reaches into the holiest cabinet of his own heritage, and he hands them the ultimate Jewish VIP titles. You are the royal priesthood. It is the most radical rebranding campaign in ancient history.
It truly is breathtaking. Now, operating within the conservative evangelical framework of our study, it's very important to clarify the theological nuance here. This does not mean that the Gentile church simply replaces or deletes Israel in some supersessionist way.
Right.
Rather, the theology argues that the church participates in the massive, expanded fulfillment of God's promises through Christ. The Messiah, the true faithful Israelite, has come, and through his death and resurrection, the borders of God's covenant people have been thrown wide open to include every tribe, tongue, and nation, precisely as God originally promised Abraham back in Genesis.
So practically speaking, how does reading the Old Testament with Peter's eyes completely change how a modern reader should approach these ancient texts? Because honestly, a lot of people open Leviticus or the minor prophets, get confused by the ancient weirdness, and just close the book. But Peter seems to be giving us a masterclass in how to read the Bible.
He absolutely is. If you read the Old Testament with Peter's eyes, you realize it's not just a dusty collection of disconnected ancient histories, bizarre laws, or moral fables. It is a unified, forward-moving narrative. Every command, every promise, every temple sacrifice, every prophecy is a flashing signpost pointing forward to the person of Jesus. And the incredible implication is this. Because believers are spiritually united to Jesus, all of those ancient promises suddenly apply directly to them. It means when a modern reader feels like a helpless exile facing a hostile culture, they don't just read the story of the Exodus or the Babylonian captivity as interesting history. They can read it and say, that is my family history. That is my story too. My ultimate citizenship isn't in this current political system. It's in the coming kingdom.
And that realization brings us to the core engine of the entire letter. If all that intertextuality was the history, we now arrive at thematic central nervous system, Christology and conduct. Because having this new, exalted identity, waking up and realizing you are part of a royal priesthood, that isn't just a warm, fuzzy feeling meant to make you feel good about yourself while you hide in your basement.
Definitely not.
It demands a radical, deeply countercultural way of living out your faith in public. And as we dive into this, it becomes incredibly clear that every single ethical command in this letter is completely animated by the person and work of Jesus Christ.
Yes. Christology, the theological study of who Christ is and what he accomplished, is the central nervous system of 1 Peter. If you cut the Christology out of this letter, the ethics just collapse into a pile of impossible moralism. We see this dynamic immediately when Peter introduces the theme of divine election and the precious blood.
Let's look at the text there. Peter says that believers were ransomed or bought back, not with perishable things such as silver or gold, but with the precious blood of Christ, like that of a lamb without blemish or spot.
Notice the imagery. Once again, he is reaching back to the Exodus, that is Passover imagery. Just as the blood of the unblemished lamb painted on the doorpost freed the ancient Israelites from physical slavery in Egypt, Peter says the blood of Jesus has freed these believers. But here is the crucial twist.
Okay.
He tells them what they are freed from. It's not a literal historical pharaoh holding a whip. Peter says the blood of Christ ransomed them from the futile ways inherited from your forefathers, or, as other translations put it, the empty way of life handed down to you.
Wow. Think about that in the context of the Greco-Roman world. The way of life handed down from your ancestors was everything. It was tradition, it was civic duty, it was the guild banquet. By saying they are ransomed from that, he is saying they are entirely freed from the crushing weight of cultural conformity. They are no longer obligated to live out the empty, cyclical paganism of their neighbors.
Precisely. If your ultimate eternal ransom was paid by the creator of the universe with his own life, you are no longer a slave to the expectations of your local trade guild. You are free from the terror of what your neighbors think of you. You answer to a higher court.
But Peter is a realist. He doesn't sugarcoat the absolute danger of living out this newfound freedom in public. He introduces a major theological theme regarding spiritual warfare. In the midst of talking about their social suffering, he gives this terrifying warning. Your adversary, the devil, prowls around like a roaring lion, seeking someone to devour.
It is a stark, sobering metaphor. Peter is pulling back the curtain on the cosmos. He is telling them that the social ostracism, the slander, the catalia they are facing at the marketplace, it isn't just bad luck. It isn't just cultural friction or a misunderstanding among neighbors.
Right, there's more going on.
He identifies a dark, malevolent spiritual reality operating behind the scenes. The enemy uses fear, isolation, economic pressure, and slander to try and consume their faith, to make them give up. That is why he repeatedly commands them to be sober-minded and alert.
But his solution to the roaring lion is so counterintuitive. His solution isn't to build a fortress, stockpile weapons, and hide from the culture. In the very same breath, he commands them to actively engage the culture with a ready answer. The text says, "Always be prepared to make a defense to anyone who asks you for a reason for the hope that is in you." This is the classic foundational text for all Christian apologetics.
And you have to look closely at the assumption baked right into the sentence of that command. Peter assumes that if you actually live this radical, countercultural life of holiness, if you maintain inexplicable joy and integrity while you are being actively marginalized and slandered, people are going to notice.
Yeah, you can't hide that.
Exactly. They're going to ask you about it. Your life should be so distinct, so beautifully strange to the Roman eye, that it provokes genuine curiosity from the very pagans who are oppressing you.
That is profound. He assumes your life will be an interrogation prompt. And when they ask, you don't scream at them, you don't fight them in the street, you calmly explain the hope. But doing that, responding to hostility with gentle hope, requires a completely different psychological view of pain. And this brings us to one of the deepest themes in the letter, suffering as fellowship. To explain this, Peter reaches back once again to the prophet Isaiah, specifically Isaiah 53, the famous song of the suffering servant.
This is where Peter's theology gets incredibly deep and, frankly, very challenging to our modern sensibilities. He presents Jesus to them not just as a cosmic savior who solved their sin problem, but as the ultimate suffering servant who endured horrific, unjust treatment, physical torture, and execution without ever retaliating. He didn't hurl insults back. And Peter uses a very specific technical Greek word to describe how this applies to the believer. Hypogrammos.
Hypogrammos. I haven't heard that one before. What is the literal translation?
It means a pattern, an outline, or a template. The best way to visualize it is to think of the wax tablets or the tracing paper that a young school child in antiquity would use to learn how to write the Greek alphabet. The teacher draws the perfect letters, and the child takes their stylus and meticulously traces over the lines that have already been drawn.
Wow.
Peter is saying that Christ's unjust suffering wasn't just a transactional mechanism to save them, it drew the heavy lines of the template for their own lives.
Oh, man. So when Marcus the baker gets spat on in the marketplace, or his business is ruined because he won't worship the emperor, he isn't a victim who accidentally wandered off the safe path. He is actually taking his stylus and tracing over the exact bloody lines that Jesus already drew.
Exactly. It gives their agonizing daily pain a profound, transcendent purpose. It completely neutralizes the shame of being a social outcast. Their suffering is no longer just meaningless victimization at the hands of Rome. It becomes actual intimate fellowship with Christ. They are walking in his exact footsteps.
This theology of tracing Christ's steps lands right in the middle of everyday messy life. Specifically, it collides with what scholars call the Greco-Roman household codes, or the hostility. A large chunk of Peter's letter is dedicated to engaging with these codes. Let's set the stage for the listener. What exactly were the hostility?
In the Roman Empire, the fundamental building hank of society was not the individual, as we think of it today in the West. The building block was the household, the paterfamilias, and maintaining strict hierarchical order in the household was considered absolutely vital for maintaining order in the wider empire.
If the house falls, the empire falls.
Right. If the household rebelled, the empire would crumble. So ancient philosophers and politicians spent a lot of time writing and reinforcing these rigid, top-down rules for social harmony. Wives must submit completely to husbands, slaves must submit to masters, and citizens must submit to the emperor.
They were the ultimate systematized tools for maintaining the status quo and suppressing any kind of social upheaval.
Yes. They were designed to maintain power. And Peter, writing a pastoral letter about how to live in society, engages directly with these well-known codes. But he doesn't just copy and paste them. According to the internal logic of the text, he subtly and powerfully subverts their very foundation.
Okay, stop right there. I have to step in and push back on this on behalf of myself and pretty much anyone with modern ears. Because whenever we hear the word submission today, especially when it's used in the context of ancient codes regarding slaves and masters or wives and husbands, it sounds inherently terrible, oppressive, and toxic.
Oh, absolutely.
It sounds like a demand for passive victimhood. It sounds like religious leaders telling vulnerable people to just roll over and accept abuse from the powerful.
Yeah.
How does Peter's version of submission look any different than the oppressive Roman standard? You use the word subverts. How is telling people to submit actually an act of defiance? That sounds like a contradiction.
I completely understand why it sounds that way to modern ears.
Right.
But to see the subversion, you have to look at the motivation and the agency. In the Roman system, why did a slave or a wife submit? You submitted because the law said you were inherently lesser, a piece of property.
Yeah.
Or you submitted purely out of terror because you would be physically crushed by the state if you didn't.
Right.
It was about sheer, unyielding power and survival pragmatism. But look closely at the text. Peter changes the foundation entirely. He tells these believers to submit to human institutions, whether it's the emperor or a master or a husband, for the Lord's sake.
For the Lord's sake. So wait, their ultimate allegiance skips right over the emperor, skips over the earthly authority, and points straight to Jesus.
Like that. Precisely. By inserting the phrase "for the Lord's sake," Peter is actually demoting the earthly authorities. He is stripping them of their absolute power.
Yeah.
He is looking at these marginalized believers and saying, listen, you don't obey Caesar because Caesar's a god. Caesar is just a man whose glory will fade like grass. You voluntarily submit to the civic order and you act with excellent, unassailable behavior entirely because your true king, Jesus, has called you to live as peaceable witnesses in a hostile land.
That is amazing.
It completely transforms submission from a posture of cowering weakness into a deliberate, proactive strategy of spiritual witness. You are choosing to serve not out of fear, but out of freedom.
That is a massive paradigm shift. The text refers to this strategy as adorning the gospel.
Right. Peter's tactical logic is brilliant here. Rome is paranoid. They think you are dangerous, antisocial rebels who hate the human race. What's the best way to prove them wrong? If you start an armed, violent revolution, you just prove their point, and the Roman legions will wipe you off the map.
Yeah, that's a battle you lose.
The only way to win is to outlive them, outlove them, and outbehave them. If Christian servants are demonstrably the most hardworking, honest, and trustworthy people in the city, if Christian spouses are the most loving, faithful, and kind, if Christian citizens pay their taxes and do good works in the community, it creates a massive, undeniable cognitive dissonance for their accusers.
It's a subversive witness. You literally silence the critics by being so irrefutably excellent in your character that their slander just sounds ridiculous to anyone watching. When the pagans say, those Christians are dangerous traitors, the neutral neighbor will look at Marcus the baker and say, are you kidding? Marcus is the most honest guy in town. He gives bread to the poor. Your accusation makes no sense.
Exactly. They maintain their radical, unbending, uncompromising allegiance to Christ But they expressed that radical allegiance through quiet, humble, undeniable service to the people around them. They were taking out their stylus and tracing the hypogrammos, the pattern of Jesus. Think about how Jesus saved the world. He didn't conquer Rome with a sword. He didn't call down fire on Pilate. He conquered the empire by dying on a Roman cross in an act of supreme self-giving love. Peter is calling his readers to wage the exact same kind of warfare.
Okay, this has been an incredibly dense, rewarding exploration. Let's start to unpack this and bring it all together so you, the listener, can carry this forward. We've gone on a massive journey today through the historical and theological landscape of 1 Peter. We started by digging into the gritty reality of the sitz im Leben. We looked at the first-century believers, mostly Gentile converts living as resident aliens per epidemoi in the provinces of Asia Minor. We felt the daily, exhausting, grinding pressure of the Catalia, the slander and social ostracism of the Greco-Roman guild system.
We saw how Peter, utilizing the brilliant rhetorical skills of his amanuensis, Silas, didn't just hand them a crushing checklist of moral rules. Instead, he constructed a magnificent literary architecture of hope. He used structures like chiasm and inclusio to validate their deep grief while simultaneously anchoring their psychology in the living hope of the resurrection.
We watched him pull off the ultimate theological rebranding campaign. He took the most sacred, exclusive Old Testament titles of ancient Israel, a royal priesthood, a holy nation, God's special possession, and he bestowed them upon culturally marginalized Gentiles to give them an absolutely bulletproof identity.
And finally, we explored how this new identity is entirely fueled by Christology. By looking at the precious blood of the Passover lamb and by tracing the pattern of the suffering servant, believers are equipped to completely subvert the Roman social order. Not through violent rebellion, but through voluntary gospel-motivated submission and irrefutably excellent behavior.
The theological framework we've explored today distills all of this complexity into 4 incredibly sharp, practical takeaways. These are principles for anyone trying to navigate a culture that feels increasingly hostile to their deepest convictions. Let's hit them rapidly. Number 1, live as temporary residents.
Yes.
View yourself fundamentally as a foreigner whose ultimate citizenship and highest loyalty reside in heaven, not in any earthly political party, corporate structure, or social system. You are an elect exile.
Number 2, adorn the gospel. Your unseen faith must be proved by your visible, excellent behavior. Let the quiet, unshakable integrity of your daily life create cognitive dissonance in your critics, silencing their slander and ultimately drawing them toward the Savior.
Number 3, suffer courageously. When you face pushback, mockery, or loss of status for your core convictions, do not be shocked. Don't view it as a glitch. Treat it as a refining fire that purifies your faith, and recognize it as a profound opportunity to meaningfully participate in the story of Christ by tracing his steps.
And number 4, lead with humility. For anyone listening who holds authority, whether in a church, a business, or a family, you must shepherd the people under your care willingly and eagerly. You are called to be an example of self-giving service, never lording your power over people, exactly as the chief shepherd did.
These are profound, timeless strategies that worked in the first century and resonate just as loudly today. But as we wrap up, I want to leave you, the listener, with a final provocative thought to mull over, something that builds directly on the foundation of the ancient texts we've explored today.
I love leaving things on a challenging note. Let's hear it.
Earlier, we discussed how Peter calls believers living stones, built upon a cornerstone, Jesus, that the surrounding culture completely, utterly rejected. Here is the thought I want you to wrestle with. What if feeling like an exile isn't a failure of the system? What if it is the essential feature of it? Think about a literal, physical stone being built into a massive wall. If a rough block of quarry stone must experience the violent friction of the iron chisel in order to be shaped, smoothed, and fit perfectly into its proper place, and if the foundational cornerstone of the entire building was entirely rejected and executed by the builders of society, then perhaps our modern obsession with seeking cultural dominance, comfort, and universal societal acceptance is the very thing that prevents us from being living stones at all. Does true, world-changing spiritual power only activate when we are pushed to the margins?
That is a staggering question. It flips our entire definition of success upside down. It strongly suggests that the moment we become too comfortable, too integrated, too desperate to be loved by the Babylon around us, we might just be losing our true shape. We stop being stones for the temple, and we just become bricks in the empire.
It's something to wrestle with deeply the next time you feel like you're swimming upstream, or the next time you feel the sting of being an outsider. Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into the survival manual of 1 Peter. There is always more to learn beneath the surface of these ancient texts, so keep exploring, keep questioning, and keep diving deep.